Today in this video, we're going to be building the legs of this slab table. And if you didn't catch the previous video, I show you how I flatten this big giant slab by hand. It's not necessarily the way I would do it every single time, but I wanted to do a video showing you that example. So even if you don't have access to a big planer or a router sled, you can still flatten a big slab. So we're going to start by milling this lumber up, running it through the planer, and each leg is going to be 3.5 inches. So then I'm going to cut it up on the table saw.
Typically for builds like cabinets, I'll draw out my actual plans in SketchUp. But for this table build, the only thing I really drew out was just the geometry of the legs. And I used just a little bit of math to figure out the length of the angled pieces and what angle I needed to be actually cutting to on the table saw. I'm going to be using a saddle joint for every joint on this leg, and I think that's going to give me plenty of strength, and it's also going to look good.
And I want to just kick myself because somehow I cut these the wrong size. Now, getting these angles and pieces the correct length with the correct angle was a bit trickier than I expected. And the best way that I found to do it was I did the trigonometry. I basically found out this length and the difference between this piece and my top piece. And that gave me a rough ballpark idea. But to get a truly perfect fit, just because of the small discrepancies that build up, the best thing to do is to cut this piece and the length of your two side pieces. Then slowly start with this piece bigger and trim it down until this gap closes up. And you can see here, I just need to take off a tiny bit more length and that gap should close up. If you try to get everything perfect just based off the math, there's a really good chance that it's not going to come together quite as good as if you do it with this method.
I made layout lines only on a few of the pieces just to make sure that they were going to be consistent, but I didn't mark it out on every single piece. That way, when I do the initial cut, I'll set my table saw settings and I know that it's going to be exactly the same for every piece that follows. And here I'm just using a tenon cutting jig that I made. It's basically scraps of plywood that run along the fence, and I made sure that it is real tight on the fence so that way there's no play or slop in it. And over here I'm using the sled that I have. It's kind of just a general purpose sled that I tack down pieces of scrap to get a certain angle, and I'm cutting the tenon portion of the saddle joint, if that's what that's called. And over here I'm cutting, I guess, the saddle portion of the saddle joint. And this one took quite a bit more work, just having to do multiple passes on the table saw. And one thing that I figured out as I was doing this type of joint is that it's better to cut away ever so slightly more on the side of the joint that's going to be inside facing. And the reason for that is that you don't want any material preventing the joint from closing in the front. So when I was paring away material, I made sure to hollow out the belly of it, and that ensured that the joint was going to be able to fully close. I didn't get this perfect on every single joint, and there was one that I had to go back in and actually take some end grain and fill. But I think in the final result, it shouldn't be super visible, and hopefully no one notices but me. For the glue up, I took some pieces of scrap and cut them to the angle that the legs were going to be, basically to counteract that angle, and then super glued them onto the sides That way I have a parallel clamping surface for those angled legs. Now I know there's those YouTubers out there that have the neatest looking glue ups with no squeeze out, no extra glue, and everything looks just perfect. For some reason, my glue ups never seem to look that way. I did wipe this piece down after I was done gluing it up, but I feel like glue ups are always messy, and this one was no exception. I used the hand plane to pare away the extra material, and after one side was perfectly flat, I ran these through the table saw to get that other side so that it was perfectly parallel with the top side, I should say. And I want to say that these were perfectly parallel off the bat, but they actually weren't. I was off by about 1/16 of an inch, which might not seem like a big deal and probably isn't, but those types of little mistakes always seem to really bother me. So you can see the joints came together pretty good, and even the big gap with the end grain ended up sealing up pretty well. And for the edges, I decided to do a small 1/4 inch round over, nothing extreme. And I didn't do this on the bottom piece or the piece that is going to be touching the floor. And for the inside edge, I just used a little bit of sandpaper to soften those edges. So someone in the previous video mentioned that that's what electric hand planers are for when I was flattening that giant slab by hand. And I want to say that I completely agree. So if any of you want to donate an electric hand planer, I'm happily accepting those. Or if you just want to buy a 36-inch planer, I would like that as well. But all jokes aside, this build was pretty fun to do these legs, and I'm hopeful that it comes out the way that I envisioned it. It might not have been perfect, but hey, that's what the next project is for, always to go for that next level of perfection that's seemingly unattainable in woodworking. If you like this type of content, hit the unsubscribe button and dislike. Thanks, and catch you on the next one.